Hello, and thank you for joining us for the Department of the Interior's celebratory panel discussion to mark progress toward conservation and restoration of wildlife corridors and habitat connectivity. My name is Shantha Reddy Alonso. My pronouns are she and her, and I am zooming in today from the traditional lands of the Piscataway people. I am the Director of Intergovernmental and External Affairs in the Office of the Secretary at the Department of the Interior. Today we will hear an exciting new set of announcements from Secretary of the Interior Deb Haaland, who will then turn to our panelists from the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, the Wyoming Wildlife and Nature Resource Trust, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So without further ado, I will pass the virtual floor to my boss, U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland.
Thank you so much, Shantha. Really appreciate this opportunity, and hello, everyone. It's so great to be with all of you today. Thanks for joining me to talk about how the Interior Department is working with partners on the important work to conserve and connect wildlife habitat and migration corridors. There are many things I love about this topic. Today, I want to name 4 reasons why I'm incredibly excited about our collective work on wildlife corridors. First, this is by its nature collaborative conservation. No one state, tribe, or federal agency can restore and conserve wildlife corridors on their own. To be successful, we must knit together our resources, our science, our various tools, our patchwork of lands, and our collective will to do our part in ensuring the best habitats for wildlife. Second, the work is happening. It's underway. It's not a theoretical exercise any longer. And this is because of the new science and tools that show us important routes that wildlife follow. There's so many inspiring examples across the country today where many people are working with nature to make a positive difference. As we're putting together today's panel, I know my team struggled to narrow it down to the 4 amazing people that you'll hear from over the next hour. They're among the leaders in our path forward to ensure wildlife corridors are a forethought and not an afterthought. Third, this is a bipartisan issue. President Biden named enhancing wildlife corridors as one of 6 focus areas in his America the Beautiful initiative. He did that because the American people believe that the federal government's time and attention should be spent in this way. And importantly, we had a head start. The Biden-Harris administration is working from a strong foundation of partnerships and a vision that previous administrations have helped to build. And fourth, when we're successful, we all benefit. Our lands and our waters are healthier, the economy is stronger, and future generations will know and love wildlife as we do today. I'll share with you what the Interior Department is doing to contribute to the administration-wide effort to enhance wildlife corridors and connectivity. First, we're corralling our resources. We have a once-in-a-generation opportunity through the Great American Doors Act and President Biden's bipartisan infrastructure law to advance collaborative conservation. Those 2 laws provide a major down payment that we can put toward the restoration and conservation of key wildlife corridors, from building fish passages and highway crossings to providing private landowners with the tools they need to improve wildlife habitats on their lands. Today, I'm very proud to announce $2.5 million in grants to promising projects across the West through a program administered by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I'm also happy to say that those awards have been matched by an additional $7 million in contributions. This successful grant program started in 2018, and last year we made an important change to ensure that tribes are also eligible to compete. I'm proud to announce that for the first time, 3 tribes are joining 7 states as recipients of these wildlife corridor grants. I know you'll hear more about this great program from Holly Bamford in just a minute. Additionally, we're adding our world-class science to the conversation. When it comes to wildlife corridors, we can learn a tremendous amount by understanding where key habitats are, including seasonal ranges, stopover areas, migration routes, and bottlenecks. If a community knows there's a major pinch point for a big game in their area, they can work to devise pragmatic solutions that will make a positive difference. Today, the U.S. Geological Survey is publishing a new report entitled Ungulate Migrations of the Western United States. This second volume pulls together the best available science, including GPS data from state and tribal wildlife agencies, to help states and partners better understand where species like mule deer, pronghorn, and elk migrate between winter and summer ranges. The last work stream I want to mention is partnerships. At Interior, we want to ensure that we have the right folks at the table to inform our decision-making and to do the work. That's why we penned an agreement earlier this year with the Western Governors Association and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to ensure regular communication on conservation issues such as wildlife corridors. We must also explore opportunities to collaborate with tribal partners to enhance tribal wildlife corridor and habitat connectivity priorities. Today, I'm proud to announce that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is formalizing a partnership with the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society to coordinate support for conservation needs. This first of its kind agreement is paired with $450,000 for the organization to ensure it has the appropriate resources to carry out its work. I look forward to hearing more from Julie Thorstenson on this soon. In addition to the three areas I've outlined, as we move forward with our work on corridors and connectivity, the Interior Department will continue to implement Secretary's Order 3362, which enhances and restores migration corridors and habitat for elk, mule deer, and pronghorn antelope in 11 Western states, and work with state and tribal wildlife managers to update our policies and guidance where needed to prioritize conservation and restoration of wildlife corridors and advance habitat connectivity. I'm excited about all of this work, and I know that we could not do any of it without great partners. From states to tribes to public-private partnerships, thank you all who are on the screen and watching online for the work you do every day to advance wildlife corridors and connectivity. Now let's hear from several leaders who will help put a spotlight on what's working. Success begets success. We can always learn from one another. First up, I'm very proud to introduce Tony Wasley. He wears two hats. He's the president of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and he's the director of the Nevada Department of Wildlife. Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Truly an honor to be here today. And I just kind of want to kick things off and remind us, 5 months ago, we saw President Biden sign the bipartisan infrastructure law that contains substantial provisions for concepts like fish passage and migration corridors, more broadly known as habitat connectivity. Just weeks after that, the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, in partnership with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, created a joint task force on landscape conservation. Clearly, the way we are approaching conservation is changing. It's becoming better informed through science and technology, more collaborative through diverse partnerships, and it's occurring at larger scales with aspirations for more of all of the above. Additionally, we've enhanced our understanding and appreciation of the importance of connectivity as an essential component of functional habitat. I think this always made sense, intuitively, but capturing it quantitatively and geographically was beyond us. All things are relative, and it's difficult to realize and understand where we are today without some reflection of where we've been, how we got here, and perhaps where we're headed. Most of my perspectives on habitat connectivity have been gleaned from my experiences in the West and with species that have landscape level movements as a basic requirement for survival. Species that might move 100 miles or more for purposes of avoiding deep snows, finding food, or decreasing the metabolic cost just to simply maintain their body temperature. I often think that modern humans with our climate control and abundant food resources are constrained in our ability to fully understand the magnitude of movements and the importance of habitat connectivity to the survival of species. It's not an understatement to say survival of some species is contingent on the connectivity of their habitat. Even migrating waterfowl with the ability of flight require connected resting and feeding stopover areas to ensure safe passage north and south. Our knowledge and understanding and appreciation of habitat connectivity and corridors has varied greatly through time. I think it's pretty safe to assume that at a time when indigenous people's survival depended on their knowledge of whereabouts of abundant game, there was a general understanding of the location of animal corridors. By the 1930s and 1940s, that traditional ecological knowledge was either no longer being shared, was not recognized as valuable, or had been altogether lost. And the rudimentary techniques wildlife managers of that time used had limited value in revealing the true complexity of habitat connectivity. We observed animals on summer range, we observed animals on winter range, and seldom did we know exactly how they got from one place to the other, or how many routes there were, or how much the animals mixed between the ranges. We had little understanding of the complexity of their behaviors and of their dependence on specific routes. We used tractors and hand rakes to smooth sandy soils to locate road crossings and count tracks in order to estimate populations. We captured mule deer and affixed bells and colored collar schemes to aid in identification of individual animals from various summer ranges or winter ranges. Our tools were simple, and consequently, so was our understanding. Fast forward to today, and through the development of very high frequency or VHF collar technology, the use of airplanes, helicopters, and ultimately remotely programmable GPS collar technology and infrared and motion activated cameras, combining this new hardware technology with software technology and analytical techniques like Brownian bridge analyses has allowed us to achieve a whole new level of understanding and appreciation for habitat connectivity, as well as its importance to a whole host of species. In Nevada, most of our initial interest around corridors and habitat connectivity surrounded two main issues: vehicle-animal collisions and corridor disruption as a result of mining-related disturbances. We were able to work with our partners at the Nevada Department of Transportation to engineer and construct multiple wildlife overpasses over state highways and interstates, as well as install numerous underpasses. As a result, we significantly improved driver safety and also created safe passage for deer, elk, pronghorn antelope, bighorn sheep, and a whole host of other species. At the same time, we worked with our partners in the mining industry to modify or redesign mine features, and consequently, we were better able to accommodate animal movements through what would have otherwise been impermeable surfaces. Presently in Nevada, in addition to the aforementioned provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the AFWA and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Landscape Conservation Task Force, we have diverse partnerships that include the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, tribes, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Department of Transportation, USGS Cooperative Research and Wildlife Research Units, particularly in Wyoming, BLM, numerous industries. We have policies, including Secretarial Order 3362 on habitat quality and corridors. We have a governor's executive order creating a statewide habitat conservation framework, and we are developing plans that include a statewide habitat connectivity plan, presently revising our State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP, whose implementation is very close to being funded by Congress with the passage of Recovering America's Wildlife Act. All of these existing partnerships, policies, and plans are ripe for inclusion in statewide, regional, and national frameworks like America the Beautiful that will ultimately help drive priorities from the ground up for collaborative landscape scale conservation, emphasizing habitat connectivity and corridors. It's an exciting time for collaborative landscape scale conservation. With the best science we've ever had, the most diverse partnerships we've ever built, and the most comprehensive plans and policies in play. 20 years ago, when I gave presentations on the importance of habitat connectivity, specifically for mule deer and the metabolic costs associated with migration and impacts of barriers on animal survival, I was often criticized or ridiculed. To be part of this discussion here today generates energy and optimism in me. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I truly appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Tony, thank you so much. That was incredibly insightful. You mentioned so many important things, and you've mentioned a couple ways that a focus on corridors has changed and improved the way that we approach conservation. I, first of all, want to thank you so much for sticking with this for such a long time, even in the face of you know, a society that didn't essentially take you seriously. So I'm happy that we're having this conversation with you today. What do you think are the most important next steps that we can take to continue to strengthen and expand the benefits of all the things that you've just talked about? And it's interesting because you mentioned tribal ecological knowledge, all the way to the amazing scientific and you know, the technological innovations that we're using today. So just your thoughts on that.
Oh, thank you, Madam Secretary. I think two things in particular, the diversity and breadth of our partnerships, and you reflected upon the scale from traditional ecological knowledge to remotely programmable GPS technology with incredible analytical techniques and everything in between. There is a growing recognition of the need for those diverse partnerships. And there's also a growing recognition for the importance of doing conservation, not only in partnership, collaboratively, but at meaningful scales. And what the science is showing us repeatedly is that we have some uniquely human biases with respect to how we view home range. And again, I think we're so reliant on climate control, and our food resources for some of us are so abundantly available. The science is helping us to truly understand the benefits of landscape scale efforts in collaborative partnerships. And we've made huge progress, and I think we have continuing opportunity to continue to grow in both those areas.
Excellent. Thank you so much again. Really happy to be on this panel with you, Tony, and appreciate everything that you've brought to the discussion. Next up is Julie Thorstenson. She's the director of the Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Julie, I'm very proud to introduce you. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours.
Mpetawashte, Julie Thorstenson. Machiapi, Uksapi Kiglu Hamni Wian, Lakota Machiapi, Melakota, Wakpawashte, Taha, Daya Hiye, Itacha, Native American Fish and Wildlife Society. Good afternoon. My name is Julie Thorstenson. I am Lakota and a citizen of the Shiner Sioux Nation in North Central South Dakota, and the executive director of Native American Fish and Wildlife Society, a 501c3 organization with 227 support member tribes. Thank you for the opportunity today on the importance of including tribes in efforts to collaborate on wildlife corridors. Tribes are leaders in wildlife corridor work. In the early 2000s, the Confederate Salish Kootenai tribe in Montana led and directed efforts to achieve wildlife and wetland mitigation for the reconstruction of the main highway route through the center of the reservation, laying the foundation for future wildlife corridor work in Indian country. This resulted in 43 underpass crossing structures and one large overpass near the Animals Bridge on US Highway 93. This was before corridors and connectivity were mainstream in the US. Thank you, Secretary, for your leadership. To begin work through the self-determination contract with the Fish and Wildlife Service, and hope this will encourage more self-determination contracts with tribes and federal land management agencies. NAFWS's mission is to assist Native American and Alaska Native tribes with the conservation, protection, and enhancement of their wildlife resources. This will be heightened by this partnership to allow for the addition of dedicated professional staff and training to focus on some of the important topics such as wildlife corridors, climate change, and biodiversity. We have already seen the benefits of having a staff member dedicated to wildlife connectivity and corridors work directly working with tribes. In just the 3 months that we have had a wildlife connectivity coordinator on staff, she has connected with over 60 tribes that are currently working on or desire to work on wildlife connectivity and corridors on tribal lands. These tribes are at different levels of readiness for wildlife connectivity, some needing funding to hire staff, some are in need of data collection, some have shovel-ready projects. Work is being done on wildlife corridors in Indian country, but communication of that work may not be. Some examples include tribes that have 30 years worth of big game migration data, but lack the time and staff to fully analyze it. Tribes that have worked successfully with their State Department of Transportation and other partners to complete crossings, such as the Southern Ute tribe in Colorado. Tribes that are not in the typical area for corridors work, but have the desire to study and construct crossings. An interest in corridor work for non-big game life, such as one tribe in the Southwest seeking to work with pollinator migration. We must remember the diversity within tribes when developing programming so that barriers to access funding and resources are not unintentionally created. One of our most common requests for technical assistance at NAFWS is to help tribes identify funding sources. The inequity in funding for tribal fish and wildlife programs is perhaps one of the most obvious but least known issues in conservation work. Tribes have historically been left out of conversations and funding regarding conservation through wording or access barriers, such as matching funds. However, the ingenuity of tribal professionals to secure funding for conservation work is amazing. Tribes are a vital part of fish and wildlife sustainability and conservation. It's important to engage tribes and Indigenous people for several reasons. Recent studies indicate that lands managed by Indigenous people are higher in biodiversity. Tribal lands and waters provide vital habitats for hundreds of wildlife species, many that need to move considerable distances to meet their daily and seasonal ecological needs. The most obvious reason for tribal inclusion is that fish and wildlife do not respect our political boundaries. You cannot truly have landscape level conservation and restoration without tribes. Tribes are great partners, often bringing a more holistic viewpoint and traditional ecological knowledge, and tribes must be actively engaged in wildlife conservation without compromising tribal sovereignty. This includes ensuring tribes maintain data ownership, management information collected on their lands. Tribes have the foundation to successfully undertake wildlife corridor work, but we need funding, capacity, and continued partnership support for more effective management. Pilamaye.
Julie, thank you so much. Appreciate everything that you shared, and you raised some extremely important issues. How do we make sure that tribes are included in on-the-ground work and funding? I know that it's important that we continue to support tribes in the work that we're all trying to do, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the biggest thing, and thank you for a question, I think the biggest thing is making sure that tribes have the capacity to be part of the conversations and meeting tribes where they're at. It might not always be a centralized meeting, but maybe providing support for tribes to engage and really listening to what they're doing. Maybe, some support and funding or partnerships to help with some of the data that tribes have been collecting. There's just a tremendous amount of work going on in Indian country. And quite honestly, I think the professionals have their heads down working and don't have time to brag on themselves very much.
Well, it sounds like it's going to be our job to brag on them. So I really appreciate that and love the partnerships. I know there's so much more work we can do. This is an all of government approach that the president has charged us with. So I know that everyone in this administration is completely on board. I really appreciate you being here today and bringing your perspective to the panel. Thank you so much. Next up.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Next up is Bob Budd. He's the director of Wyoming Wildlife and Nature Resource Trust. I had the pleasure of meeting Bob on my trip to Wyoming last year, and it's clear that few people know the land better than Bob. Bob, we're very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
Madam Secretary, good morning. It's nice to see you. Thank you very much for including me and the state of Wyoming in this panel. I'm not a migration expert. I thought Tony did a fantastic job of talking about the issues, the ecological and biological background. Really, what I'm here to talk about a little bit is what we've learned how to accomplish conservation at a landscape scale. As you know, Wyoming has an incredibly strong track record in that regard. We've had a bighorn sheep working group. We started out the greater sage grouse with our sage grouse implementation team. We've done rivers and reconnected thousands of miles of spawning habitat, forest health and wetland health, and most recently, migration. One of the things that I have to remind everybody that's very important is that state primacy over wildlife is a constitutional reality, but more importantly, it is a fundamental value of Wyoming citizens, be they tribal or otherwise, and we care about our wildlife. Like the federal government, we have kind of a dismal history of trying to legislate and regulate forced conservation. I don't know where we lost our way, but I think back to a quote from Aldo Leopold when he said, there are two ways to apply conservation to land. One is to superimpose some particular practice upon the pre-existing system of land use without regard to how it fits or what it does to other interests involved. The other is to reorganize and gear up the farming, forestry, game cropping, erosion control, scenery, or whatever values may be involved so that they collectively comprise a harmonious, balanced system of land use. That's 70 years old, and somewhere we forgot that. So when we changed back to our approach to a locally led, inclusive process, conservation became incredibly easy, whether it was through the Wyoming Wildlife and Natural Resource Trust, our Recreation Task Force, our Wildlife Task Force, Sage Grouse Implementation Team, or most recently, the Migration Executive Order brought to bear by Governor Gordon. We have incredible support for this from a very conservative legislature. We've had 3 governors who have supported this process and been integrally involved in it. We have county governments, which are equally conservative, who are bought into this process and this procedure, and a wide range of interests, from conservation groups to oil and gas companies, mining companies, ranchers and farmers, and sportsmen. We also value our federal partners, and that oftentimes is not said enough. They have been at the table in every one of our endeavors, and we value their input, their knowledge, and the fact that they do control half of this state, especially when we all can get to where we work in the same manner to achieve a common goal. The key is finding ways to reward people for their actions. And that isn't just money. Certainly money helps, and we have the ability to match that to do the kind of things that people are talking about: overpasses, underpasses, fence modification, potentially habitat leasing down the road, long-term easements. But one of the other things our federal partners can do is to help us remove barriers to getting work done on the ground. That may be streamlining NEPA. It may be eliminating contracting and going back to the partnerships that we've enjoyed for the past decades. It may be figuring out ways to deal with cultural clearances and address those issues in an expedited manner. It may be bidding requirements. And I know Secretary Haaland that you're very dedicated to working on removal of those barriers. That will be a huge, huge step forward. I'd close with another quote from Leopold, perhaps my favorite, and that is that most of what needs doing must be done by the farmer himself. There is no conceivable way by which the general public can legislate crab apples or grape tangles or plum thickets to grow up on these barren fence rows, roadsides, and slopes. Nor will the resolutions of the city change the depth of next winter's snow, nor cause corn shocks to be left in the fields to feed the birds. All the non-farming public can do is provide information and build incentives upon which farmers may act. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's great to see you, Madam Secretary, and here's to moving forward post haste in getting these things done. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bob. That was wonderful. I loved your quotes. You're absolutely right. I mean, I've always felt that it was my job to make sure that I'm supportive of all the work that's happening around the country, and certainly you've given us some examples of that. Bob, can you say more about some of the important lessons that you've learned from Wyoming's collaborative process? You know, the things that make sense to share with the broader community. Collaboration clearly is something that you feel has happened, and the reason why Wyoming is doing so well in these areas. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think we've learned three important things. One is that you have to have all of the players at the table. You can't exclude people and get this done. That seems to be transparent, but at times we don't do that. We huddle in our corners and then we all come at each other from oblique angles, and that doesn't work. The second is that slow is fast. Having more people in the room appears to be slower, but you don't have to go back and replow the same ground time and time again if you do that. And third, and most importantly, the closer you can get to where the deer actually live, the more effective you will be. Everything we've done that's been recently that's been effective has been spearheaded by local people who all buy in and commit, and they own the result. And so we try to drive everything from the state level to the local level, local working groups. And I think that's critical, that this not be top down, but that it be bottom up and that it be owned by the people on the ground.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm so happy that you're here. It's lovely to see you again. And of course, I hope I get to come back to Wyoming again.
We'd love to see you, Madam Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Last but certainly not least, I'm very proud to introduce Holly Bamford, the Chief Conservation Officer at the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Holly, it's so good to see you. Thank you for joining us today. And
thank you. Let's see if we can get my video here. Oops.
Well, we can definitely hear you. So that's
okay. It looks like it says it says the host has stopped it, but we'll see if we can get it working. Well, oh my gosh, thank you, Madam Secretary. I'm really happy to be here for the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and I do want to thank you and the DOI team, the other panel members. I think you heard some great comments, which really demonstrates great commitment to conserving great migrations. So as you mentioned, hello, sorry. Finally get to see you. As you mentioned, Madam Secretary, NIFWF is really excited to announce our, with DOI, the grants from the Western Big Game Migration Fund. You know, this fund was launched in 2019, which really was a direct result of the Interior Secretarial Order 3362 and is a significant support to America the Beautiful objectives, as you mentioned earlier. The goal of this fund is really to provide the resources to private landowners, community-based nonprofits, tribal entities, state agencies across the West to really help them efficiently work together to conserve state and tribal priority habitat corridors for big game herds. And as we heard from Tony and others, fragmentation is a significant threat, and these funds are really trying to be used to help address those issues. Now, since 2019, NIFWF has awarded $12 million through this fund to 52 projects across the West, which is leveraging an additional $60 million that these partners are bringing to the table, these grantees. And so it's an all hands on deck approach. And this includes the 13 grants that you actually announced today. So we're really excited. Just one thing about the grant program, I think it's really unique because we heard a lot of comments today about public-private partnerships. And this truly is a public-private partnership. And it's taking both public funds from federal agencies such as BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, NRCS, and leveraging them with private corporations and foundations like ConocoPhillips, Bezos Earth Fund, Altria, Microsoft, to really help these projects go to scale. And I think the value of leveraging both public and private investments help address some of the barriers we heard from Bob. It allows us the flexibility to address many of the needs, like voluntary conservation easements on working lands. To date, we have awarded over 100,000 acres of private land to voluntary conservation easements. So we're really proud of that. You also mentioned, Madam Secretary, the need for science and understanding. We heard from Tony about new technologies. This fund gives us the ability to really take risks and to test out some of that low tech and high technologies. And I'll give you a great example. We heard fence modification. As Bob mentioned, we need fencing. We need it to be more wildlife friendly. We need to reduce direct mortality. And so a couple of years ago, NIFWIF invested in some research to look at the new fence modification, what's more friendly to wildlife. And you would think just changing fence would be easy. It's actually not. We did a study looking at pronghorn, and as you know, pronghorn go under the fence, not like mule deer that go over the fence. So we wanted to look at what would they avoid, what would they accept in terms of different fencing. And so you have the traditional barbed wire fence. We replaced some of it with smooth wire. We also did what you call goat bars, which is putting PVC piping over the wire. And when we observed the pronghorn through cameras, the pronghorn hated the goat bars. They were like, did not like the PVC piping. They completely avoided it. But what we learned is they liked the smooth wire and they liked it at a certain height, which was also very effective for keeping cattle in, but at the same time, allowing the pronghorn to migrate. And so this fund really allowed us to bring that to scale. We are now using that best practice in Montana, New Mexico, Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, across the West, really to implement that. And now more recently, this fund also allows us to invest in more of the high-tech technology around fencing. So there's been some issues in the state of Washington where landowners have been losing their fence to wildfire, and so they have to replace it on a regular basis and also keep up the maintenance. And so what we funded through this program was to look at more high-tech fencing where you could use new virtual fence technology where, like a pet fence where you put a collar on your dog. This would be putting collars on cattle, and they would be able to sense basically an invisible fence, which allows the cattle to stay where they should be, but also allows, again, you don't have those negative impacts from traditional fencing. And so this is still under development, but this fund allows a lot of these issues that we heard from Tony and Bob and Julie to kind of really be able to address that. And we're really excited about that.
Holly, that's great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your input and perspective here. In your role at NIFWIF, I know you see lots of innovative efforts. You talked about some of those innovative efforts to conserve corridors. What are some of the multi-jurisdiction and cross-state tools you've seen that work best to create wildlife corridor connectivity?
Oh, yes. Thank you for that question, Madam Secretary. I think it's a really important question when you're dealing with a landscape scale issue like conserving and protecting large corridors. And first, again, because these funds include contributions from federal agencies and non-federal, it really provides the ability, or I should say flexibility, to support a diversity of projects across state lands, tribal lands, federal lands, private lands that really address these cross-jurisdictional issues. And so you really need an all hands on deck when you're dealing with these issues on different landowners and different land types and different authorities from different federal agencies. How do you look at that from a larger perspective and bring that together to address these cross-jurisdictional issues? And then second, because these funds can fund along entire migration corridors, they're not restricted to one state or a couple states, but really can go across multi-states, as well as bring in the tribal nations and the tribal lands. We can use a mix of the state plans that are out there, as well as the tribal big game and land management priorities that Julie was mentioning, and really identify those landscape scale needs. And then as we put these slates together, these 13 projects that you mentioned today, we're able to really build from each of those projects a cohesive set of projects that can address some of these cross-jurisdictional issues. So even if a project is located in one state or one kind of landscape, we look at it more collectively so we can really address some of those bigger issues that we're all hearing from the partners out there in the West. So we're really excited to be able to tackle some of those and move those barriers out of the way so others can apply and address those in a collective fashion. And as you mentioned, the projects that you announced are across 7 different states. They're benefiting 3 tribal nations. And we're just really excited that we can help work, build that as best we can and listen to our partners and continue to improve the grant making process. So again, thank you for today.
Absolutely. Thank you as well, Holly. And thank you all so much, all of the panelists who took time out of their busy schedules to join us here. Thank you for the great work that you're doing to advance wildlife corridors. I am incredibly humbled and inspired by the partnerships that are moving this work forward in the right way and in the right places. A final thank you to the many individuals and organizations watching today's discussion who are also playing an important role in making things happen, from scientists to nonprofit organizations to tribal leaders. All of you are awesome, and thank you. I look forward to the announcements and celebrations to come, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you again.